If you turn with me to 1 Samuel, we're going to look this morning at chapters 18 and 19 and making some observations as we look at the story of Saul and David unfolding now and really beginning to become center stage, obviously, here in Samuel. And God is working in David's life. And in response, we notice several things happening that I think if we're to look at our own lives and maybe lives around us, we see similar things happening, whether it be as a church, whether it be as an individual. I think a lot of times we see some very similar things happening in our lives when God begins to work. And so we want to see in 1 Samuel what begins to happen as God is working in and through his servant David. 1 Samuel chapter 18, starting in verse 1. Where it says, as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. Now this is right after what we saw last week with David bringing down the giant Goliath. All of Israel was trembling in fear of Goliath. Nobody wanted to come out and challenge him one-on-one. David was the only one who would not stand back and let the name of God be blasphemed, but who said, I will go, I will fight this giant, and I have no doubt in my mind that God is going to bring me the victory. And so, as we saw, Saul didn't even know who David was, and calls for David to find out who exactly he is, whose son is he. And so right in the heels of that, David is speaking to Saul, and it says, the soul of Jonathan, we've already been introduced to Jonathan as the son of Saul. It says he was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Now, there's a lot of people who try to make this into something that it's not. They say, well, look, he loved David, and so there's something weird going on there. But the word love there is a very generic sense of love. Throughout the Old Testament, it's used for a lot of different types of love. Is it used for a romantic love? Yes. But it's also used for the kind of love that you have for your mother and father, for your brother, sister, for your children. It's the same kind of love that you would use for your friends and the people closest to you. It's the kind of love that you'd use to describe a love that you have for God. So it's a very broad sense of the word love, but there is this instant connection between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. It says there in verse 1 that his soul was knit to the soul of David. It was bound together with David's. It was leagued together with the soul of David. Now I think there's a very simple reason why. Because these two guys are so incredibly similar. Now earlier in Samuel we saw how Saul, the king, and the army of Israel was paralyzed with fear, not knowing what to do in terms of facing a battle with the Philistines. And so they're all sitting back, and Saul's hiding in a cave. And his son Jonathan decides, I'm not going to sit back and do nothing. I'm going to go fight them. So he takes his armor bearer with him, and the two of them go and single-handedly just take out the Philistines, and the Philistines go fleeing. Now we see almost the exact same thing happening with David. Saul is hiding in fear. The army of Israel is paralyzed in fear, not knowing what to do, none of them knowing how to respond to the threat of the Philistines, the threat of Goliath. And David steps forward and says, I'm not going to sit by and let this continue. I'm going to go fight them by myself. And so he does what Jonathan did. And he says, this isn't about me. If this is about me, there's no way I can beat Goliath. There's no way I can take on the Philistines. But the battle is not about me. It's not my battle. It's God's. And God is going to bring me the victory. And so here we see these two men with these same hearts, the same passion, the same soul, the same focus upon God, the same concern for the glory of God. It says their souls were leagued together, knit together, bound together. He loved him as his own soul. So much so we're going to see that Jonathan is willing to surrender the throne, which I think we kind of overlooked that in the story. We just so assume that, well, David is the next to be king. We forget that Jonathan is the son of the king. That Saul is advancing in age, that Jonathan should be the one who's ready now to step into his father's place and become king. But Jonathan will never once confront or challenge the notion that David should be king next. He willingly, voluntarily steps aside and says, yep, this is the guy. This man should be king. Because he understood David's heart. They were, in a sense, the same man with the same passions and the same focus. And Jonathan he's never like his father in the sense that all Saul cared about was himself. Jonathan's focus isn't on himself. Jonathan's focus is ultimately what is best for the glory of God. Verse 2, and Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David. They pledged allegiance with David and with each other because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David. A very powerfully symbolic act here. And his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. Remember, the only swords in Israel at this point one belonged to Saul, the other belonged to Jonathan. Jonathan takes not only his robe, not only his armor, but everything, and he gives his sword. I mean, this is a pretty precious commodity. There's only two of them, his and his dad's. He gladly takes his and surrenders it over to David. In verse 5, and David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. When God begins to work in a person's heart, you begin to see people uniting together. Now, by that, I think there's something very significant. Because we're about to see Saul respond very badly to what God is doing in David's life. He becomes very jealous, he becomes filled with anger, and seeks to kill him on more than one occasion. And repeatedly, we're going to see Jonathan stepping in to help protect David, to help save David, to help keep David out of harm's way. And these two men are united in this brotherhood of the glory of God. There's something very significant for us as believers. That when God begins to work in somebody's life, to unite together with somebody else in whom God is working. Because otherwise, it's a very lonely battle. I can't think about what it would be like for David to have Saul hunting me day after day after day, and to not have a Jonathan. To not have somebody there who can help keep that flame fanned into. That's too many F's in one sentence. To help keep that passion strong. To help keep that focus where it ought to be. I found in my own life that when you surround yourself with other people in whom God is working, that stirs something in your soul. That motivates you, that encourages you, that creates within you a desire for what they have. That's what this should be. What we're doing right now, and all of us gathering in this place, ideally should be a place where we gather together and fan into the flame of what God is doing in our lives, to encourage each other, to motivate each other, to spur one another on, to continue to seek after God with everything we've got, to continue to give God everything we have. A lot of times I understand how it can be in churches. We've all been there. I've been there, where it's more comfortable to talk about stuff. It's more comfortable to talk about just life instead of the things of God. Not only the victories and the praise reports and the testimonies, but also to sharing that sense of our need. Saying, I need prayer for this. I'm struggling in this area. I need prayer for this. There's a tremendous power that comes when we can come together and say, you know what, I really need your support. I need prayer in this area. I think a lot of times we're afraid to do that because if I tell this person where I'm struggling, all of a sudden the whole church is going to know. And then they're all going to think I'm some weird outcast, and all of a sudden I'm kind of banished. Rather than all of us understanding that, we're all struggling. All of us in this room had some struggle this week. If not this week, probably the week before, or the week before that. I'm not sure many of us would have to go very far back into our past without saying, I was really up against the wall here on this day or this week. Do we share those things? To share those struggles, and then to share how God brought us through them, to encourage each other, to motivate each other, to keep going, to keep praying, to keep serving, to keep surrendering, to keep Christ first. David and Jonathan have this brotherhood of the glory of God, of keeping each other strong, of having each other's backs. I think this becomes very significant. We see in verse 6, Saul's jealousy begins to flare up. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, with musical instruments. Now, we know Saul's track record. We saw when Jonathan had his single-handed victory that Saul kind of took it for him. He took credit for the victory. So I can't imagine what's going through Saul's mind here. They come back and there's this huge celebration. People are coming out, they're making all this racket and celebrating, and Saul's like, Yeah, bring it on. That's me. Yeah. I brought the victory. Yeah, you're welcome. But then notice what they do in verse 7. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands. Now again, Saul's like, yep, that's right. I brought down my thousands. But then the song goes on. Verse 2 of the song. And David is 10,000. Uh-oh. That's not good. The king just came back home. And the people are celebrating the king. But they're saying, yeah, the king did some great stuff, but David did a whole lot more. See, it wasn't just Saul struck down his thousands and David his 2,000, 10,000. This was above and beyond what Saul has done. Now this is going to eat Saul alive. Because Saul's about Saul. Saul wants the credit. Saul wants the attention. In verse 8, and Saul was very angry. And this saying displeased him. Now, on the one hand, Saul could say, you know what? It wasn't like Saul can't say, you know what? I should have been the one to take on Goliath. He's up there in age. It probably would have been better strategically to send a younger warrior there. There's no shame on Saul's part in that, in and of itself. Him hiding or being afraid, that's a different thing. But Saul could very easily say, you know what? I did my part. David did his part in all our conquests. I fought battles. I've won victories for God. I've done my part. David did his part. Yeah, David had a greater victory than I ever have. So what? We're all doing this for the sake of our God. It's not about us. He very easily could have just enjoyed the fact that he's had a part in what God was doing, and God's brought along David to do a part in what God wanted to do. But instead, he wanted the credit for himself. He wanted the attention. He wanted the glory. He becomes very angry. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. He begins to watch David. He's obsessed with David. He's consumed with the people's focus on David. In verse 10, the next day a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had a spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. So it's not just like Saul has a really bad day and he's just fed up with David, and he throws the spear at David once and it doesn't work. He does it again. This is the second time. But notice David, he keeps doing this day after day. You know, Saul tried to kill me yesterday, but I'll come back and play for him again today. Keep doing it. Notice how Saul's responding. It's gone from jealousy. At first he's jealous of the attention that people are giving to David. Now he's obsessed with David. Now he's becoming angry at David. Well, what did David do wrong? He did nothing wrong. His jealousy has turned into anger against David. He's now spiteful of David to the point where he's now trying to kill David. David saved Saul. If it wasn't for David, Saul is still up there on the side of the mountain, hiding in fear from Goliath. And who knows how much longer that would have gone on until the Philistines decided, let's just go invade them. They're not going to come after us. Let's just go invade them. David ultimately saves Saul's life, saves Saul's rulership. And how does Saul respond? Hate that guy. Kill him. Not once, but twice. I'll try it. It doesn't work either time. But now verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. The word departed there means it was taken away from Saul. In other words, you get this imagery of whatever God gave to Saul, he took away and gave to David. And now Saul is left with nothing. And we saw back in verse 5 where it says, and David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. And now in verse 12, he was afraid of David because the Lord was with him. And verse 13, so Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. He's trying to, in a sense, kind of demote David. You know, forget the 10,000s, here's just 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. This rising tide of support And love for David is growing stronger and stronger. And here now we've seen 4 different references. Verse 5, David was successful wherever Saul sent him. Verse 12, the Lord was with him. Verse 14, David had success and the Lord was with him. The Lord was no longer with Saul. Saul was jealous of David. Then he had anger towards David. Now he's trying to kill David. Now he's afraid of David. He's become obsessed with David. This is the difference between David and Saul. As we said several weeks ago, David is not a perfect man. But David's heart is turned towards God. Even when he fails, his heart turns to God in repentance. Over and over and over, what is the habit of Saul? He doesn't turn to God. He turns to himself, or in this case, he's just turning to anger at David. What should Saul do in this moment? I think that as standing back, I know what Saul should do, but I wonder how many times I've done exactly what Saul is doing. Saul's watching God work in David's life immeasurably, abundantly, working in David, working through David, granting David success, and just blessing David. At some point, Saul can step back, or should step back, and say, Lord, what's in me? Lord, where did I go wrong? That you're not granting me the success that you've granted David. Lord, how is it that you're working in David and you're not working in me? Lord, what is it that's in my life that needs to change? He very easily could have used this as a moment to truly come before God and say, Lord, I saw what you did in Jonathan, how he trusted you, had faith in you, and you just blessed him and gave him victory. And Lord, I've just not seen those victories. I've not seen you work through me in those ways, and now I'm seeing you do it with David. Lord, whatever is in me, please show it to me. Lord, I confess it before you. But instead he gets jealous at David, angry at David, wants to do away with David. How often do I do that? How often do you do that? You hear somebody talk about what God's doing in their life, how God's answering prayer. And instead of saying, wow, Lord, that is so great, I praise you for that, or saying, Lord, I haven't sensed you granting me that kind of success. I haven't seen you answer prayer in my life the way that you did with that person. I haven't seen you working in my life the way that you've worked in that person. Lord, is there something in me? Or maybe it's just your will to not do it, and that's fine. But Lord, is there something? Is there something, Lord, that's keeping your Spirit from working through me the way you've worked through that person? And instead, what do? We try to discount or discredit what that person's saying. We attack it, or we become jealous of that person, or begin to hate that person, or have anger toward that person. I'm sick of them talking about that all the time. They just stop doing that. I'm tired of hearing about it all the time. Instead of using it as an opportunity to come before God and say, Lord, whatever you're doing with them, would you please do it in me too? Show me if there's anything that's blocking that. Lord, maybe there's not. Maybe there's not. Sometimes God just chooses to work in a person, a situation, one way differently than He does another. That's fine. Sometimes we can default to that, and well, God's just not doing that. Rather than, Lord, is there something in me that's not as it ought to be? Saul could have said, Lord, is there something? Have you just chosen to work through David out of your sovereign choice, and you've decided not to work through me that way? If so, great. But Lord, is there something? Had he truly come before God and said, Lord, is there anything? I believe God would have shown that to him. But this has become the repeated hardness of Saul. Always turning to himself. Always taking credit for himself when God works. Always, we see in this case, hating David because God's working in David. David didn't do a thing wrong. I mean, in honesty, have you ever been around somebody who was just always praising the Lord? Just always just Jesus and Jesus and Jesus. And sometimes there's a part of you that's like, we just come to reality. Rather than, Lord, why am I not more like that? How come my heart isn't like that? How come I'm not full of as much joy as that person is? Lord, how come I'm not as expressive in my love for you as that person is? We can say, well, it's just my personality. Maybe. Maybe there's something else going on too, though. Do we take that time to come before God and just say, Lord, please show me if there is something. Maybe there's not. But maybe there is. But so often we never even give God the chance to show us if there's something in us. Maybe there's something that if we recognized it and repented of it, confessed it to God, then His Spirit will begin to work. Maybe had Saul not been so hardened, God finally gave up on Saul and pulled the Spirit off of Saul. What could have been true? What could have happened with Saul? What could have God done through Saul? And he just turned to God and said, Lord, I've seen you work in my son. I've seen you work in David. Lord, I want that. I want you to be glorified through me. Lord, is there something in me? But instead he becomes jealous. And often when God works, the people who are, for lack of a better term, left out of it, who are not seeing God working, instead of saying, Lord, is there something that has to change in me? They become jealous or spiteful or begin to attack those in whom God is working. Verse 17. Then Saul said to David, here is my elder daughter, Merab. I will give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul, now, if I'm not mistaken, if you go back before the whole thing with Goliath, he had already promised his daughter in marriage, but obviously hasn't delivered on that so far, probably because he hates David. But now there's a change. And he offers to give Merab as a wife. He says, I'll give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. This isn't a change of heart of, you know what? God's working in this guy. I recognize that. Why be against him when we can work together for the glory of God? No, this is, you know what? Let me just put him in the front lines of battle. Interesting, because David's going to pull the same thing later on, but let me put him in the front lines of the battle. So I don't have to fight this. I'm obsessing myself. I'm, in a sense, making myself look bad to anyone else who's watching me because I'm obsessed about trying to kill David. There's an easier way to go about it. Put him in front of a bunch of troops, say, hey, go fight the Philistines, and oops, sorry, David, you died. Oh well, let's move on with it. So he decides to set a strategy here. He's going to bribe him by offering him a wife. Verse 18, and David said to Saul, who am I, and who are my relatives, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? But at that time, when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel, the Meholathite, for a wife. So Saul's plan wasn't as sincere. Verse 20, now Saul's daughter Michal loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. And Saul commanded his servants, speak to David in private, and say, behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servants spoke those words in the ears of David. And David said, does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation? And the servants of Saul told him, thus and so did David speak. Then Saul said, thus shall you say to David, the king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies. So he's like, oh, easy. I'll just send him on an impossible path that will surely get him killed, and my problem is Saul. Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And when the servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. Before the time had expired, David arose and went, along with his men, and killed 200 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Well, that's the prettiest image, but... And Saul gave him his daughter, Michal, for a wife. Now, at what point does Saul say, you know what, here's a guy who told me face to face that when he was out being a shepherd, God granted him victory over bears and lions. I doubted that. But then he told me that God was going to give him victory over Goliath. And I saw with my own eyes, God granted him victory over Goliath. Why is it that Saul thinks that this is a foolproof plan to get David killed? Because he still doesn't get it. Saul's focus has always been on the numbers, on the stuff, on human effort. And again, he's still thinking there's no way David can march into the Philistine camp and pull this off. He will be outnumbered, he will be killed. Saul is repeatedly forgetting that this was God fighting on behalf of David and will grant him even this victory, as impossible as it may have seemed. In verse 28, for when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, we're getting this phrase a lot now, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David, for Saul was David's enemy and king. Then the princes of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul. So his name was highly esteemed, or literally his name was prized. It was considered precious among the people. What does Saul do with this guy? He doesn't know how to handle it. Everything he sends him out to do, thinking it's going to end in David's death, David has great victory. So he just becomes his flat-out enemy. And Saul has now become obsessed, basically, with trying to find a way to stop David, to kill David. It's interesting, when God works in a person's life, when God works in a church, you better believe there's an enemy that's going to find every opportunity to kill it and to stop it. If you haven't seen that in your life, you probably will at some point. Remember the first church I went to after the Lord saved me? It was a tremendous church I've talked about before. Prayer was vibrant. People were coming to Christ, and it was a wonderful place to be. And then things changed on the side. All of a sudden, personalities started to clash. Divisions started to brew. And all of a sudden, the whole thing just came to a screeching halt. And I've seen a similar pattern over and over in all kinds of different circumstances. You see God begin to work and do something tremendous. And all of a sudden, something gets in the way. Something comes up. Sometimes it's sin in a person's life. And all of a sudden, as God begins to work, we get lazy, we get casual. You know, God begins to grant victory, God begins to move, and we start to think this has something to do with us. So we get casual about keeping our guard up and taking every thought captive, putting on the whole armor of God. And all of a sudden, that work of God can be stalled or stopped because of sin in our lives. Sometimes it's through circumstances. Don't be shocked if you notice God begin to do a work in your heart or a work around you, and all of a sudden everything just comes at you, just nonstop. One mess after another, after another, after another. Sometimes a big mess, sometimes a little mess. Both can be bad. You get that one major crisis in your life, that's bad, but sometimes it's that barrage, that Chinese water torture of stuff that comes in your life. How does that ruin or interfere with what God's trying to do in your life? Because you become distracted. Your focus shifts to the circumstances. Your focus shifts off of God. And all of a sudden now you're consumed in the circumstances coming against you. And a lot of times, subconsciously or even consciously, you can begin to connect the two. You know, I was having this great prayer time and everything was going wonderfully, and now everything's just falling apart. It's not working. You know, I'm just going to go back to just a comfortable, content Christian life. You know, I'm not getting all excited about prayer or serving God or anything, and things were fine back then. When I started really seeking God in prayer, stuff started getting messed up and going wrong in my life, so I'm just not going to do that anymore. It's safer not to do that. So often those circumstances can be used just to discourage us, distract us, take our focus off of the Lord. Sometimes that circumstance could even be a hobby. Leonard Ravenhill talked about this man that he knew who was just a wonderful man of God who was being used by God mightily. He said, then he decided to get into stamp collection. Nothing wrong with collecting stamps. He said, all of a sudden, this is all the guy cared about anymore. He lost his passion for the Lord. He wasn't praying like he used to. And the working of God in the man's life just seemed to be cut off because he got obsessed with a hobby. Sometimes those circumstances become a distraction in keeping our focus on the Lord. Sometimes it can be people who become that tool of the enemy. That doesn't mean they're demon possessed, but sometimes when God's beginning to work and that fire's growing for the Lord and your focus is on Him, then all of a sudden there's that coworker who just out of the blue just starts digging into you day after day after day. That one person who just feels the need to just attack you or insult you for no reason. And all of a sudden you get hit with a brick. You just focus on the Lord again. Sometimes it can be people who begin to complain at you, attack you, become antagonistic towards you. So that often that can become a tool that the enemy uses to distract you, to discourage you, to get your focus off of the Lord. If God begins to work, be aware that Scripture talks a lot about a spiritual battle that's going on around us. When God begins to work, when God begins to work in your life, when God begins to work in our church, don't be surprised. Now, it doesn't mean live in paranoia of it, but don't be surprised if the enemy doesn't somehow, some way get involved. He's not going to sit back and say, wow, the Church of Jesus Christ is rising up in power and serving the King and just advancing the kingdom. Wow, what am I ever going to do? He's going to throw stuff. He's going to fight back. It's going to happen. Does it mean that we become obsessed about it or fearful about it? No. There's 2 kids in the house always. I didn't seclude myself in a bubble. Face it day at a time. Take every means necessary to stay healthy. Just press through. Spiritually, we can't allow spiritual warfare to distract us from what God is doing. Because so often we can start putting more emphasis on the enemy than we do upon the victor. And that can become a distraction. I would say when it comes to spiritual warfare, treat it like sickness. Now, you can become very obsessed with sicknesses. You can become germophobic and just live in a bubble or live with a constant supply of hand sanitizer, that kind of stuff. Most of us just eat healthy, wash your hands, don't get in the face of sick people. We don't live obsessed with being sick every day, most of us. But you take steps to keep yourself healthy. When sickness presents itself, you handle it when it arises. But it doesn't consume you. Spiritually, yes, there's a battle going on. Don't let it consume you. Don't let that become your focus so that you're no longer focused on the Lord, you're now focused on the spiritual battle. Put Him first, seek Him first. When things arise, deal with them as they come. Keep the focus on the Lord, but know that by any means necessary, there's an enemy that's going to try to throw something at you. So I don't know if anybody's ever read the book Screwtape Letters. Very powerful but disturbing look at spiritual warfare. There's so many different things that can become a distraction. They can just take our focus off of Jesus Christ. Think about Peter. Peter's walking on the water. But for a split second, he became more focused on the storm and the wind and began to sink. God was doing something there with Peter, doing what nobody else had done. Walking on water. That's pretty cool. I can imagine what that would be like. Took his eyes off of Jesus and began to sink. So then in that, he reaches back out to Jesus. Jesus lifts him up. They walk back to the boat, and then the storm dies down. So often, as individuals, as a church, we can keep our focus on Jesus, and God's doing something tremendous. It's like we're walking on water for the glory of God. But then something happens. Something comes. And our focus shifts. Even slightly. And all of a sudden we find ourselves no longer on the water, but now we're just kind of flailing to stay afloat. If and when that happens. And we could easily say, forget it. It's all done. No more point going on. Well, what does Peter do? Lord, forsake me. Jesus pulls him right back out. A lot of times what we do, spiritually, we do in so many aspects of life. You know, if you think about trying to eat right, I've been trying to do that and making better choices. There's those times where you eat something you shouldn't have eaten. Now, in that moment, you've got a choice. You can say, you know what? No, probably shouldn't have eaten that. You've got to get back on track, eating better things. Or you can say, ooh, sweet. Well, I blew it, so I might as well just go back to how I used to eat. Spiritually, we can say, you know what? Yeah, I took my focus off the Lord. So sorry, please forgive me of that. Put our focus back on Jesus. Or we can just stay on the sideline and say, oh, Lord, you know what? There's no point. Why even bother? Lord, seeking you again. I messed it up. Get the focus back on Jesus. There is a battle. And it's going on, just like you see with Saul, that when God's working in David's life, Saul is trying to stop it at all costs. Put that focus back on Jesus. Now, very quickly, chapter 19, which isn't going to take but a second. Saul spoke to Jonathan his son, and to all his servants, that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, Saul my father seeks to kill you. Therefore be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are. And I will speak to my father about you. And if I learn anything, I will tell you. And Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, Let not the king sin against your servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought good to you. For he took his life in his hand and struck down the Philistine. And the Lord worked a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. When they will, why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan. Saul swore, As the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. And Jonathan called David, and Jonathan reported to him all these things. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as before. And there was war again. And David went out and fought with the Philistines and struck them with a great blow, so they fled before him. Then a harmful spirit from the Lord came upon Saul, as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand. And David was playing the lyre, and Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear. But he eluded Saul, so that he struck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, that he might kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, If you do not escape with your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. So Michal let David down to the window, and he fled away and escaped. Michal took an image and laid it on the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair at its head and covered it with the clothes. And when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, He is sick. Then Saul sent the messengers to see David, saying, Bring him up to me in the bed, that I may kill him. When the messengers came in, behold, the image was in the bed, with a pillow of goat's hair at its head. Saul said to Michal, Why have you deceived me thus, and let my enemy go, so that he has escaped? And Michal answered Saul, He said to me, Let me go. Why should I kill you? Now David fled and escaped, and he came to Samuel at Ramah, and told him of all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and lived at Naioth. And it was told Saul, Behold, David is at Naioth in Ramah. Then Saul sent messengers to take David. And when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, and Samuel standing his head over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. When it was told Saul, he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied. And Saul sent messengers again the third time, and they also prophesied. He just keeps sending them to a revival. Verse 22, Then he himself went to Ramah, and came to a great well that is in the Siku. And he asked, Where are Samuel and David? And one said, Behold, they are at Naioth in Ramah. And he went there to Naioth in Ramah, and the Spirit of God came upon him also. And he went, and as he went, he prophesied until he came to Naioth in Ramah. And he too stripped off his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel, and lay naked all that day and all that night. Thus it is said, is Saul also among the prophets. Last thing that we see here is Saul is becoming more aggressive, more strategic in his efforts to try to kill David. And what does David do? With the help of Jonathan, they have a strategy. David doesn't just say, hey, you know what? I've bobbed and weaved his spear a few times now, and I've been okay, so I'm just going to keep sitting back and bobbing his spears. Jonathan intervenes and helps him escape. His wife intervenes and helps him escape. There is activity on their part in the midst of this. Is God working in David? Yes. Is God working in David's surroundings? Yes. Does that mean that David sits back and does nothing? No. There's still things that David is to do. There's still things that those around him are to do to keep this going. There's a lot of attitudes about how God works and a lot of perspectives about how God works. A lot of ideas about how God works and revival and things like that. That God just sends it no matter what you do or don't do, and He's going to sustain it no matter what you do or don't do. And when He's done, He's going to end it no matter what you do or don't do. I haven't seen that in practice. What I've seen is revival, a work of God, is a work of God. It's a sovereign act of God's kindness and mercy and grace. But there is still human activity that He calls for. He calls for His people to pray. He calls for His people to confess their sins. He calls for His people to worship Him, to seek Him first, to surrender to Him. It is the work of God when God works. But there is human activity. There are things that He calls us to do so that that work can happen among us, so that that work can be sustained among us. What is He calling you to do to be a part of that? Prayer, worship, fellowship, seeking Him, confessing sin. We just sit back and say, well, we're just going to sit back. When you decide to do something among us, great. Let us know when it happens. The things that God has called us to do. I think you see that in Scripture. I think you see it repeated throughout history. That God works in response to what He's asked us to do. Think about the times even in our own church when we've seen God work in great ways. And we always hear about the YMCA and back in the mid-'90s when God was doing some neat things. I think if you look back on that, you can see that there were things that people were doing. Not to earn or deserve a work from God. Not as God worked as a reward for what people were doing. But in response to the human activity of confessing sins, of prayer, of seeking Him, surrendering to Him, God began to work. You see that over and over in Scripture throughout history. Are we seeking Him? Are we praying for God to work among us? Are we confessing our sins? Are we worshiping Him? Are we fellowshipping with Him in such a way that His Spirit in response will work among us?